Everybody, for a company named after a bloke called Trevor that knocked out fiberglass cars from a shed in Blackpool, TVR has had far more than its fair share of great cars. And today, I'm driving one of the most adored and also fearsome, the mighty Cerbera. How long does it take for a car to become a legend? For some, it can be the work of years, countless sleepless nights, and many, many hours beavering away at building the ultimate, whatever it is you want to build. However, for those of a certain age, the legend of the TVR Cerbera was forged in just 31.2 seconds. One of the things that I love about doing this job is that it's a way to connect with history in a very real and direct way. And just in case you aren't aware what I'm talking about, or maybe you can half remember, how does this sound make you feel? Because that makes me feel about 7 years old again. For everybody not in on the joke, what am I talking about? Well, back in 1996, Jeremy Clarkson released one of his Christmas videos called Clarkson Unleashed on Cars. This was very significant for a number of reasons. First off, it helped establish Jeremy Clarkson as an entity on his own. Secondly, if you pay attention, you'll notice that those videos didn't really follow the format of Top Gear as it was then, but did instead lay the template for what Top Gear was going to become. That particular episode featured the Ferrari F355, declared the greatest car in the world ever, but it also had a drag race, not featuring the 355, but instead a who's who of some of the other great performance cars of the day: a Lotus Esprit, a Caterham M7, an Aston Martin, I think it was Virage, and a 911 Turbo. Amongst those was one of these, a TVR Cerbera, and over a standing mile, the Trevor absolutely obliterated the competition. As it happened, the history books are now fairly certain that that particular car was far from standard. It was advertised as being the same as this, a 4.2 litre car making some 360 horsepower, but the rumour is that car instead had a full-fat race engine from the TVR Tuscan Challenge series, making quite a bit more power, which would explain its absolutely devastating victory over some much more expensive rivals. To give you some context of just what kind of performance this car was offering, the TVR was just £40,000, and the 911 Turbo, 296, was 94 grand. That's actually not the most amazing Ferrari I've seen this morning, because earlier, while doing the drive-bys, this came past. Today is a good day to be a petrolhead. And as petrolhead cars go, I think there are few more raw, focused and wild than the Cerbera. Though in some ways it was TVR's attempt at making a nice, soft, more comfortable and dailyable car, it's still a TVR through and through. And the Cerbera, as it happens, was notable for a number of things. Peter Wheeler had taken over TVR in the 1980s, but it was in the 90s that we began to see some of the most iconic cars ever to come from the Blackpool outfit. It was the Griffith and Chimera which in the 1990s really established TVR's reputation as the go-to choice for someone that wanted something loud, brash and rather different. A refreshing alternative to the common 1980s yuppie-mobile, the 944 Turbo. Those cars were both powered by the venerable Rover V8, which in TVR form went up to 5 litres in displacement for the top models, like the Griffith 500. However, at that time a deal was being done for BMW to take ownership of Rover, and Peter Wheeler was uncertain how long supply of those engines was going to last. It is at this point in time where any normal, sensible person would go shopping for a suitable replacement off-the-shelf engine, something like a Chevrolet small block. But Peter Wheeler was never someone to take the easy or obvious route. That rather nasty noise, by the way, is apparently very, very useful because the self-cancel for the indicators here doesn't actually work. A big thank you to the channel fan who's been following me in the Audi S1 to notify me that also, in typical TVR fashion, the brake lights aren't working. So sorry to anyone else that's been following me today as well. Anywho, TVR wanted an engine of their own, so what they came up with was the AJP8, otherwise known as the Speed 8. The model designation coming from the 3 people involved in its development. A for Al Melling, maverick engine designer and all-round nutter, but apparently a real legend. I've spoken to him on a couple of occasions, and trust me, there isn't anything that man doesn't know about engines. The second was John Ravenscroft, and the third was Peter Wheeler. What they came out with was a flat plane crank, 72 degree, naturally aspirated V8 displacing initially 4.2 litres. It made 360 horsepower and 320 pound-foot of torque, which is about 430 newton meters. It was a single overhead cam design with 16 valves, and early examples also featured dry sump lubrication. It was tested in the most TVR way possible by being thrown in the front of the Tuscan Challenge cars and sent out every single weekend to be hammered within an inch of its life. For any manufacturer, regardless of size, to come up with a new engine is a very, very big deal, particularly one as small as TVR. To give you some context, they sold only about 1,500 of these cars ever. I simply cannot imagine that the maths on building your own engine to really only ever put in one car would ever work out. And it gets worse too. Firstly, this engine was designed with some very unusual parameters, and Al Melling has gone on record as saying that if Peter Wheeler actually had relented and given him a wider engine bay to work with, it would have been much more potent than it is today. Wheeler was a man very well known for trying to cut costs at every available opportunity, and for that reason, I don't think he wanted to redesign the front of his cars to accommodate the new power plant. The irony being that the Griffith and Chimera never actually received this engine. They were powered by versions of the Rover V8 for the entirety of their run, and this engine never saw service anywhere else either. So really, an awful lot of compromise was made for an engine that had an incredibly short life. To add insult to injury, it was also made pretty clear fairly early on this engine was going to have a very limited lifespan because there was no way to get it through the then upcoming emissions regulations. Rather than take this opportunity to do the sensible thing, TVR instead built another engine, the 4-litre Speed 6. The last Cerbera I drove had one of those in, but I've been waiting so long to try one of these with the power plant it was always intended to get, the AJP8. Compared with the later 6, the 8 has actually been fairly well behaved. A few early examples have big problems, but generally speaking, they've proven to be quite durable. The rumour goes the only reason the Cerbera really existed at all is because Peter Wheeler needed something suitable to put his new engine in. He felt it was going to be far too potent for the Griff or Chimera. And you know what? I am so glad they chose to build this, because there really is nothing else quite like a Cerbera out there. It has a roofline that is impossibly low. Though on its own it looks like a fairly large car, it's actually tiny, only about 4¼ meters long. Top tip, if you ever want to put a TVR in reverse, put it in fifth first. 3-point turn hill start torch test. The clutch in this is got a really high biting point, and I would like to leave Tony some of it. There we go, not too bad, no whiff of clutch, we're okay. And we're off. The clutch has a really stupidly long travel, which is totally unnecessary. The throttle also has a famously long travel, and that is quite necessary because these cars have no driver's aids whatsoever, like pretty much every other TVR made. So no traction control, no stability control, no ABS. You do have power steering though. And here's the thing, the legend of TVR is that they built some pretty wild, crazy and out there stuff, which was great to look at, had a very funky interior. I mean, look at this, it's absolutely off the wall. I love it. Touch sensitive buttons for the windows, which barely work. A little isolator key down here that I've been warned absolutely do not touch because nobody knows what will happen. A heater that really won't behave and only gives you hot or roasting, and styling that's from another world. This is absolutely balmy and I love it. Well, I don't actually love this particular one. The colour combo is very, very odd, as is the choice of tweed, I think, for up here and back there. I've never seen that in another Trevor. Pretty much all Cerberas are unique. That's the nature of the beast. You could have essentially whatever you wanted. In fact, the only reason these didn't come with a cheapy, nasty plastic interior is because for the numbers TVR were building cars in, leather was less. They aren't the sort of car to be owned by somebody who's obsessed with panel gaps matching, because they just won't ever. In fact, some on this car are absolutely hilarious. The one just behind the rear screen in particular, yes, that's by design, but that's atrocious. That's absolutely awful. You could lose a cat in there. Though Tony, this car's owner, would be the first person to tell you this is not a pristine example, I think actually it's a little bit better than he implied in his emails. Sure, a few points have started to wear, but you have to remember, this is an old car now. This particular one is not as youthful as it may appear. Later Cerberas got the Tuscan front end, like this, but this is actually a 1996 car which has had that grafted on later down the line. A somewhat popular thing to do, and not always an indicator that a car has had a crash. You'll have to excuse me, I do need some air in here. Come on, window down, there we go, there we go. Oh, that's better. TVR call this interior a 3+1, and I think that's actually pretty accurate. You're not going to get much behind the driver, but you will get two adults over there. It's actually very generously sized. Has a pretty big boot too, and if you are on the taller side, Peter Wheeler himself was, I think, about 6'4", so he wanted to make sure that he could fit in all of his cars, and therefore you should be all right too. I'll tell you something, put your foot down and it really does move. It makes a very distinctive sound, that V8, because of its unusual 72-degree flat plane layout. I don't think there's really anything else that sounds quite like it. Makes a distinctive smell too. This car is currently running without catalytic converters. Very common TVR thing, because they can cause a lot of issues. I would personally put sports cats on, and Tony may do that later on. Bear in mind, this is still a work in progress, this car. A lot of people told me that compared to the Speed 6, the V8 really does need some revs, and I suppose there is some truth to that. It doesn't actually spin all that high, think about 7,000 RPM, but worryingly, Tony has also told me there is no mechanical or electronic rev limiter in this car, so you can just rev it until it goes bang, which I don't intend to. In reality, by about 6,500 RPM, you do feel like that's a very natural place to change up. It's from about 3,000 RPM, the engine pulls pretty well, and the last sort of 1,500 RPM from 5 grand above really are quite entertaining. TVR's power figures on occasion have been known to be somewhat creative, shall we say. But here, I do believe the quoted 360 horsepower, which is then combined with a curb weight of less than 1,200 kilos. TVR, I think themselves said about 1,100. The reality is they are about 1,175, so that's pretty darn good. Especially as, with the window up, yes, I am cooking, but it's also really quite comfortable. The suspension is excellent. We don't know exactly what's on this car. I think it's gas gold. The fact is, there's basically not a single TVR out there still running its original suspension, or if there is, a lot of work has been done to it. One of the big issues with these cars, and one of the reasons they gained a reputation for being so sketchy, is that TVR put on some quite decent quality suspension components and then didn't align them. And stuff like that annoys me, not just because TVR were playing with people's lives, but because there was no need for the cars to be that dangerous. They just needed to spend a little bit more money and time in making sure all the cars were sorted. Unfortunately, it's actually TVR's popularity which is often credited with killing them, because when they didn't sell all that many cars, the workforce had plenty of time to do the sort of quality control you need for a car that's built in a shed in Blackpool, probably by people called Robert. However, when stuff like this came out, which it did in 1996, and the company really started shifting cars, they didn't employ any more people or give them any more time to make quite a few more cars. Therefore, all those little jobs like checking panel gaps, making sure that everything worked, just went straight out the window. And that's when TVR really gained the reputation it has now for unreliability. The later Speed 6 certainly didn't help things. But today, buying a TVR is almost safer than it ever has been. These had an awful lot of problems with the chassis and later ones with the engine. The truth is now, most Speed 6s have had a rebuild by somewhere reputable like TVR Power, and the chassis have all been sorted. Either they've been replaced with a fresh one, been repaired if they were salvageable, or they were well cared enough from the off that they were never an issue. We think this car may be one of the latter. We believe it's on its original chassis, needed just a little bit of work done to it, but generally speaking, it's good. Apparently, earlier cars were a little bit better protected against corrosion from the factory, with later ones suffering a little bit worse. The brakes are really quite decent, though they make a real racket. That's a safety feature, that's so people know you're approaching. Like electric cars in town. And that engine is so sweet. Oh. Here's the other thing. The last TVR I drove was a Tuscan S, and as wild and crazy as that was, with its 4.5 litre engine that's not from factory, it was a bit rattly. So much so that when I got home, I found out that halfway through it had shaken my camera so badly, the focus had gone off. This is actually far more composed, actually a genuinely comfortable car. The seats do help, they're not particularly supportive, but they are comfy. Wild looking things as well that match this interior down to a T. On a day like today, I'm not scared of the car in any way, shape or form, though if it were wet, I may change my tune. And if the aircon in here actually worked, I think I really would consider dailying this, at least through summer anyway. Fuel economy we shall not discuss, but genuinely, pretty much every part of the Cerbera is just so much better than I expected. I'm sure at some point it could go horribly, horribly wrong if you disrespected it, but it talks to you, it communicates. The steering is some of the best in any car ever. Tony tells me compared to his Chimera, he has considerably more confidence in the car. I think by making these a fixed roof, they do make the whole thing a little bit more rigid, therefore a little bit more predictable, and it does just work. Yes, it's rough around the edges. No, if you're the sort of person that obsesses over little details and expects, luxuries like fully working buttons, this is not, nor will ever be, the car for you. That famous TVR reliability actually did strike Tony this morning when he went to fill the car up and then couldn't unlock it. Happily, it resolved itself, so yes, it will break, but is also occasionally self-healing. Sort of £30,000 people want for these, there are also still quite a few examples out there that, though not terrible, also aren't as good as they really need to be. And one thing I have encountered in the TVR world is there are a lot of people out there who will blame stuff on TVR which actually isn't a TVR problem. Very often they'll excuse something as being, oh yes, that's just how they are, and actually what they're trying to do is cover up panel damage or a crash or simply poor maintenance and servicing. Unfortunately, servicing and maintenance is one area the Cerbera doesn't do so well. The old Chimera and Griff do tend to be fairly easy to keep going because the engine is an old Rover V8 and all the electrics and bits in the car are chiefly from older British cars, so there's nothing really particularly expensive. Here, there is a lot more that is bespoke, which means it's much harder to find and also more expensive, and the engine itself, even if nothing has gone wrong, is also quite expensive. The tappets are manually adjustable and it's recommended they're checked fairly frequently. So, according to the TVR Power website, even a minor 6,000 mile service is still £700 plus VAT, which, let's be honest here, they will probably find something else, so you're talking about £1,000. Did I mention this indicator stalk is also on the correct side of the car? Which I quite like and appreciate. A 12,000 mile service is going to set you back more like 1,200 quid. Those are Ferrari service prices. And that's before anything's broken. Some cars, I go down this piece of road and I'm absolutely terrified of them. It's very broken tarmac, there's some sudden camber that appears, disappears, all sorts is going on. But you know what? This car is absolutely planted, feels very, very reassuring, exceptionally well damped, and it's still quick. In fact, the power to weight ratio of this is superior to the Audi RS e-tron I've been driving recently, because that's got less than double the power, but is more than double the weight. So if ever you thought that maybe one of these with a 4.2 isn't perhaps potent enough, nah. It'll do the business. Even there we took it up to about 4,000 RPM and it was sensational. I love it. Quick, not so fast that it is scary, but involving and special. This is a British handmade car with an engine that never went anywhere else. And it's a good engine. I like this engine. I know it's the 6 that tends to get a lot of the attention now, both good and bad, and mostly because it was attached to some very well-known cars like the Cigaris. But if you actually want the complete package, the usable car, and it has to have a TVR badge on it because you're just that way inclined, the Cerbera is brilliant. Be prepared for a tumultuous relationship, but honestly, I think it's one that's going to be well worth whatever commitment is required. Every now and again, I'll look at a Cerbera in the classifieds and think, oh, that is quite a cool car, but it's a TVR. I want the roof to come off. Then I drive it and I go, Cerbera in my future? Maybe. Guess I have to try the 4.5 now and see whether that really is as much faster as TVR claim. They reckon that one makes about 420 horsepower, but TVR numbers always were a little bit creative. The good news though is that the driving experience really is just as fantastic as everyone's told you. If anything, it's a little bit better. So, a huge thanks to Tony for bringing his car out, to you for watching. As ever, don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and even if you have, make sure you press the bell icon so you'll be notified of every new video release. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.